the time to come out. I know everybody's busy. Whomever it was who just noted in the chat that they were juggling bedtime, I totally get that. My wife is heroically handling dinner and bedtime in my absence. I'm really grateful for that. So, folks, we'll dive right in. Last week we reviewed the changes in American life that created conditions conducive to polarization. We talked about our human brains and the growing body of research that suggests that we are in some ways wired for polarization, or at least a form of tribal group identification. And then last week, we talked about the unique factors in the United States that appear to be causing this notable rise in threats and even acts of political violence since 2016. I promised that if you stuck with this, we would get to the happy part, and that is tonight. So over the next, 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share a range of strategies for thinking about what we can do about this. And I have to emphasize that we're going to be done at 7 Eastern. We have 53 minutes to unpack a very complex topic. So the best I can do in the time we have for all of you is give you a framework for thinking about what we can do about this and a range of suggestions and best practices. Much of what I'm about to present could itself be the subject of a 4-day skills building training, which we don't have time for. But I am going to hopefully give you some practical things that you can walk away with that you can try in your daily lives, in your relationships, in your communities, and so on. So with that, part 2, what can we do about it? Everybody see my slides humming along? Okay, so this slide you may remember from last week. I'm opening with this slide because 1994 wasn't that long ago, at least not for a Gen Xer like me. The point I want to make here is that, yes, I mean, this graph illustrates how we've sorted by political ideology over the last few decades, but not that long ago, party affiliation was not salient in our identities in the way that it is now. 1994 was not that long ago. So it wasn't always like this. Further, here's some data on how both houses of the US Congress have voted, more or less since the Civil War. And so this graph covers a period from like 1870 to the late aughts, 2007, 2010. And of course, measuring how congresspeople vote vis-a-vis their ideology it's not a perfect measure. But this is one way of thinking about polarization, right? How members of Congress vote can tell us something about how closely aligned or divided the parties are. And what this graph is illustrating is that, arguably, in our nation's past, not so long ago, we went through a period of marked depolarization in the early 20th century and mid 20th century. That is one way of interpreting this data. So there is, I would argue, evidence from our own history suggesting some ability to depolarize. That said, can be a lot of buts, good news and bad news throughout this conversation. As we discussed at some length last week, this polarization problem is very big and complex. Again, we'll share these slides. Again, they have a few footnotes. If you want to read more, read Peter Coleman's book. It's pretty good. This book that he wrote is a kind of a guide to all the things you can do to experiment with addressing polarization. But he starts with this point, right? This problem is really big and complex, like we talked about last week. I am repeating this just to set expectations, right? Nothing I'm going to say in the next 50 minutes is going to unlock a magical key through which you will never again argue with your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. It's just more complicated than that. But there are things we can do. So I have come up with a framework for thinking about the problem. I call it cousin, community, and country. I picked those words because they all start with C. Cousin is just a stand-in for interpersonal relationships, individual relationships. Could be with your cousin, could be with a high school friend, could be with a family member, coworker, whatever. The point is, there are ways to think about the polarization problem and tactics to employ that are particularly relevant for one-on-one engagements. Okay, so think about it. Level of intervention 1, you and your neighbor, as an example. We'll talk about that. And I would argue that, especially at that interpersonal level, what you're going for is humanizing, building trust and understanding. If you are pretty liberal in your politics and you don't regularly talk to people who are pretty conservative, I'm going to give you a set of suggestions for how you can engage in certain specific relationships with the goal of building your understanding of that person's perspective and vice versa. That's level 1, cousin. Community is groups. How do we think about this polarization problem in groups of people? How do we set up differing groups for success? If you're going to bring a group of people who lean left and a group of people who lean right together, what do you do to ensure that that interaction is as effective as possible? And then finally, country. You know, we closed the discussion last week with an exploration of the unique quirks of American democracy. I noted that there's a lot of political science that suggests that the quirks of our system make us vulnerable. They make our system unstable. They are opening us to some degree of violence. So if we want to solve this problem, that leads into questions of how to reform the system. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Let me pause. Does this make sense? 3 levels. And mind you, these are not black and white, right? The techniques we talk about for engaging your cousin are also things you may need to bring to bear in a group setting, right? But in terms of an analytical structure for dividing out these complex problems, I find it helpful to have a bit of a typology. Any questions about this? And mind you, I can't see all your faces, so just yell at me if you feel unheard. I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Christine. Okay, so with that, we're going to dive into level 1. Oh, no, we're not going to dive into that. I can't see my next slides. Okay, note of caution. Yeah, another caveat. So this is worth noting, right? This is also from Coleman's book. Just keep in mind, again, that this is pretty hard, and set your expectations accordingly. Okay, with that, cousin, what do you do here? So I think the first thing I'd recommend is, wherever possible, remember to try to humanize yourself to the person you're engaging with. These are my kids. This is Rosie and Charlie. On Christmas morning, I had just assembled this pipe play structure thing that Santa brought them. Here they are. You don't have to have kids to do this. Maybe you've got a cute picture of your dog, your cat. Pick a thing. The point I want to emphasize here is, don't start with the hard stuff. Don't dive right in on the issues that you disagree on. Remind the person you're trying to engage with that you are more than your politics, right? And ideally, you pick a thing where you will have some shared experience. Maybe that's being a parent, maybe that's being a cat lover, right? That'd be my first suggestion. Second, when you're in that conversation, okay, let's say you decided you want to begin a process of engaging with that uncle you're always fighting with at Thanksgiving dinner. There are a number of pretty classic, long-standing techniques for ensuring that you're listening to the other party as effectively as possible. Nothing that I'm about to say here is like earth-shatteringly new, right? And I suspect if any of you have had any sort of training in dialogue techniques, active listening, this is all going to be very familiar, but sometimes it's my job to repeat the obvious. So, of course, don't call them names, don't interrupt. Practice active listening. I assume everyone knows what that refers to. You are intentional about confirming the things you're hearing with some light reframing. Oh, so I hear you saying that blah, 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 to show the other person that you're really listening to them. Number 4, listen to genuinely understand, right? Don't be thinking about what you're saying. Listen, because you get into these arguments with your uncle every Thanksgiving, and this is an opportunity foremost to understand where he's coming from. Listen to reflect moral values. This is key, right? After you've listened to your, uncle at Thanksgiving dinner go on his rant, pick out the values that he is reflecting in the things he's saying. Let me be clear. You don't have to agree with what he said. Let's take a hypothetical. You're a conservative. Your uncle is very liberal. Your uncle advocates for perfect open borders, right? And he says that we have an obligation as wealthy Americans to care for everyone else in the world as much as possible. Okay, you're not an open borders person, but you could say, I hear that you're really concerned about the suffering of those who are less fortunate than us in America, right? So again, you're not agreeing with the person's position, but you're trying to tease out what makes them tick underneath what they're saying and show them that, okay, that's valid, even if I disagree with your position on immigration. Okay, so let's say this is a 2-step process. Let's say step 1, you listened. Now it's your turn to talk. How do you most effectively make your case, right? Start with a nice pivot, right? Confirm that you've heard what the other person said. I hear you. Reflect agreement where you can, right? Pick out one thing that your uncle said, latch onto that, even if it's a small thing. Say, yeah, I'm with you on that, right? In my previous work in the Middle East, I spent many, many hours negotiating with Hamas officials in Gaza and other parts of the Middle East. And in some cases, I spoke with people whose views I found deeply concerning, maybe reprehensible. But I was there to get things done, to try to move them, to convince them to do things they didn't want to do, maybe clean up their human rights record, compromise with Palestinians or Israelis. And so I would find something in what the other person told me that I could use to reflect some shared understanding, even if I didn't agree with 98% of what they said. Well, we can all agree that conditions in Gaza are very, very difficult, that people are suffering, right? So find something like that, even if it feels very basic, and articulate it. Then, when you're doing the talking, when you have the talking stick, it's always very useful to tell the story of why you hold your views. We all have our origin stories. Certainly by the time you've made it to adulthood, I mean, most of us, at least those of us who are politically active, we have a certain worldview. Explain to your uncle where that came from. What shaped you? Why do you feel the way you do about, pick a thing, immigration, abortion, right? Again, doesn't mean your uncle is going to agree with you, but it humanizes your position. It makes it easier for the other person to empathize with you, even if they don't agree with the substance of your argument. Signal strong feelings. If you know you're moving into terrain that is really emotive for you, personal, pick a thing. Maybe it's maybe crime. Maybe you're talking about crime or the criminal justice system. Maybe you've been a victim of violent crime. Before you get onto that topic that really triggers you, warn the other person, hey, I should just note, I have really strong feelings about this. Or it's hard for me to talk about. I just want to warn you, sometimes I get a little emotional about this, or I get a little hot under the collar. Signal that before you go into that terrain. Finally, again, per our theme of setting expectations, don't assume you're going to agree, right? This is an exercise in listening. It's an exercise in sharing your worldview, what shaped you, and really absorbing the other person's worldview. And on that note, if you're going to do this, again, this is interpersonal engagement, do it for the long haul. if I could make a recommendation, something you can do when you leave this call, pick one relationship in your life across the political divide that you're going to try to have multiple engagements with, right? Maybe it's your uncle, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a neighbor, but in your own mind, remember, they may not be down for that, but go into it thinking, okay, Uncle Bob and I'm going to keep at this. We're going to talk regularly, over a period of 6 months. So I would recommend you choose a relationship for this long-term engagement, commit to doing it over and over, and remember why you're doing it, which is building understanding and trust, right? Probably not changing the other person's mind. There's a lot of data about this. It's just really hard to do that, right? But in this world of polarization and political violence, that understanding and trust building piece is really, really important, right? In a democracy, disagreement is totally normal. That's why you have a democracy. You got to adjudicate these things. You got to have elections and make policy, and sometimes you got to compromise. That's normal. The dangerous terrain our country is in is that we've gone from disagreeing to demonizing, right? Some Americans have gone into a place where they're painting the other side as enemies who are worthy of violence. And this kind of process can help you solve that problem. It's not going to make you agree with your uncle, but at least it may help you feel better and feel that this person is not a six-headed monster, hopefully, in most cases. Not always, but in most cases. All right, let me pause there. Any reflections on what I've shared? Questions, comments? Things you strongly disagree with? I can see some of your faces. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I put this in the chat, but I want to say it out loud too, that technique of signaling that you have a strong feeling before you jump into it. I just find that really empowering because I know I'm going to get hot before I get hot. And I start to worry about how that's going to affect the relationship and the conversation. So yeah, just wanted to give a big thumb up to that. And I definitely want to try it.
And I can't see the chat, by the way. So Antoine or Anna, if you do see things in chat, please lift them up for me. Any other reflections on this or experiences you've had trying to do this? All right, well, we'll have more time for discussion at the end. So let me move into the second section here, which is intergroup engagement at the community level. So this gets into somewhat different mechanics. Everything I just said, still relevant. The interpersonal skills, active listening, being very careful about how you communicate, right? All that is still valid, but there are some other dynamics that come into play here. When you're working at the group level, find shared identities that you can lift up. This is a meme that went around on the internet, particularly in Pittsburgh, after the Tree of Life synagogue massacre, which was probably the worst act of anti-Semitic violence in U.S. history. And in the aftermath, somebody made this graphic where, as you can probably tell, they took the logo of the Pittsburgh Steelers, very popular NFL franchise in Pittsburgh, and they changed the upper diamond with the Star of David. What's being communicated here? This is a simple way of signaling that essentially everyone in our community, we don't agree with what just happened. It's horrible. We're Pittsburgh. We're Steelers fans. We stand together. We don't stand for that, right? That's really important. Find things, especially when you're engaging with groups, that you can lift up together. And sports fandom, that's no joke. That's not nothing. Think about that. If you're, especially depending on where you are in the U.S., what franchises are big. If you're up, I do work in Wisconsin. Always good to talk about the Packers, right? North Carolina is a big basketball state, right? But things like that could be food, right? What about local identities around certain foods? I grew up near Buffalo, New York. Take our chicken wings very, very seriously. Most other chicken wings suck. You can start with that, right? Find ways to remind folks that they have things in common that go beyond what divides us. First general point. Second, there's a whole lot of research that's been done over the last few decades on how to make intergroup contact effective. So going back to the work of this guy, Henri Tajfel, there was this fairly simple idea, somewhat simplistic, that if you take two groups who are different, let's say, white Americans, black Americans, you put them together in a room, those two groups having to do something together, that this is going to help reduce prejudice or stereotyping. And there is some truth to that, but subsequent research, and this little grid kind of neatly lays out some best practices here, makes clear that if your goal is to bring two different groups together in a way that helps them get to know each other, increase trust, reduce stereotyping, whatever, there are some things you can do to try to set yourself up for success, right? So there are 4 things listed on the left side of this table. Okay. Equal status, cooperation, common goals, and wider social support. So I'm not going to read all this to you, but the basic idea here is, if you're thinking about, getting some big group dialogue together, and you want to pick, liberals and conservatives, pay attention to who's in those groups. Don't set yourself up for success. Don't make this too hard. Look at socioeconomic factors, right? Try to ensure that, pretty much everyone economically is on a similar playing field, right? If not, it's going to be more challenging. The second thing, cooperation and the common goals, like you might start with a shared project, right? Or at least ensure that you're in a wider environment that's not competitive, that's not designed to, put the two sides butting heads against each other. Look at the wider social structures, the bottom one there, support by social institutional authorities. I mean, this is more relevant in the international peace building context, right? There's a lot of sad examples, for example, from the Israeli-Palestinian context, where you would have these intergroup interactions between Israeli and Palestinian kids, which would be unto themselves somewhat successful. But then you put the kids back in their conflict contexts, that Palestinian kid still, lives under Israeli military rule, still sees his father humiliated at some checkpoint by some 18-year-old Israeli soldier with an assault rifle. And all the nice things you did together in the little, soccer game you hosted don't amount to a hill of beans, right? So think about the wider environment, think about setting up sort of structures around your engagement that minimize some of that. Also, nothing wrong with taking the indirect approach. To the point I made earlier, like pick a shared project. Maybe get the Republicans and Democrats in your county. Get people from the 2 county party apparatuses to pick up litter on a section of highway together, right? The kind of thing where you put a little sign up, do a shared project. Even, and this comes out of Peter Coleman's book, apparently, there's even research that going on a walk together, something about the act of walking, like physically gets us in sync, gets our biorhythms working more smoothly together. Think about having fun, just do social stuff, right? Like ease into it, have a holiday party, host a happy hour, right? All of these things help you create an atmosphere of some understanding where you're setting up conditions that would allow you to then address the more difficult stuff. Work with what's there. Leverage existing cross-partisan institutions. Okay. There aren't a lot of these left in American life, I'll be honest. I mean, there's lots of evidence of church congregations have kind of divided along political lines, right? As we talked about last week, we've been moving to live in counties where people vote like we do. But look around, maybe, the Rotary clubs of the world. There are still these spaces, some religious congregations, some workplaces actually, where people are already brought together. They have to rub shoulders and kind of get along despite their political differences. So when you can find those institutions, work within them, right? Because again, it gives you some foundation that the participants share in common already. This is key to the work I've been doing with the Carter Center. Cultivate leaders with credibility across the divide. Find messengers, find people who have a little bit of space maybe to step away or to message or engage in a way that's a little bit different from their tribe, right? Find those people who carry water with others, and try to bring them into these efforts. And relatedly, this is really important. Again, it speaks to my day job with the Carter Center. Look for opportunities to strengthen positive norms. So if you're engaging with groups, right, find ways to set expectations about how we should comport ourselves, right? This is a lot of what is fraying in America, right? I mean, it's fair. I think it's fair to say former President Trump is a fairly unique actor in terms of his ability to damage these kinds of norms. And then in turn, kind of like we talked about last week, to legitimize a kind of discourse that is potentially very, very harmful, demonizing groups of people in ways that, for example, may make them targets of violence. So the way you push back on that is you find groups of people who can work together to say, no, we don't agree with this, right? And you'll see the conundrum that a lot of folks on the right are dealing with right now, right? It's been true for several years. Individual folks in the GOP who have risen up quite, I think, at some great personal risk and cost to criticize certain anti-democratic trends in their party, they get hammered. They get hammered. They may lose an election. They may lose their livelihood, right? That's hard. That is no joke. The antidote to that, and it's not easy, is you got to work in groups. You've got to organize quietly to find blocks of people who can come out en masse so that it cannot be so easily dismissed or picked off. If you want to read a book about the theory behind this, Christina Bicchieri's piece, Norms in the Wild, and this was actually one of my inspirations for this project, she was researching how to eradicate female genital mutilation in parts of East Africa. And what she found was, if you can convince all the elders in the village that this thing we've been doing for however many years is bad, we should all stop doing it, and you can get them to come out as a group and say, we've changed our mind, let's not do this anymore, you can change that social norm. You can make that thing that was acceptable no longer acceptable. So think in those terms, find groups of people you can move and try to move them together. An example of this is an initiative of the Carter Center and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Center. Going back to 2022, we were trying to get candidates for office to sign on to our 5 principles, right? It's the same basic concept. You get people to say, yes, I will abide by these basic standards. And we tried very deliberately to recruit Democrats and Republicans. We made a big hoopla about it, put them up on a website, right? Put out press releases. Because you're signaling to the rest of America or, to your community, pick your target audience, hey, these are the standards that everybody agrees to. Now, let me be very clear. I was not born yesterday. Obviously, there are some Americans who don't agree to these things. No kidding, or we wouldn't be in this mess. But this is an exercise in political communication. This is about pushing out a message that we need people to hear to change behavior, right? In an ideal world, these kinds of messages, things like these candidate principles, become widespread enough. They're in the ether. You turn on the TV, wherever you to go to get your news on the internet, you see people whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or Donald Trump or whomever, saying, yeah, I support this. That's how you change norms. That is how you ensure that a guy like former President Trump can't upset the apple cart, because he sees that people he needs, voters he needs, people who maybe lean very conservative, still support these principles, right? That's how you change norms and put some of this anti-democratic behavior back in a box. Find opportunities for this work. This is sad to say, but it's true. Violence can sometimes be an opportunity to reset some of these norms. I mean, an obvious example from our country is the horrific Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. At that time, it leveraged a whole new, very bipartisan discourse about threats from right-wing white nationalists. And it really put those kinds of actors on the back foot for a long, long time. There was a national mainstream consensus that this was awful, and guys who supported this kind of stuff were super dangerous, right? The 1980 bombing of a train station in Bologna, Italy, by radical partisans. I mean, this was something that put this like sort of bubbling specter of political violence in Italy between the far right and the far left, really put it on the front page and allowed for a kind of cross-partisan consensus between the right and the left among the political class that this had to stop. Okay, and so look for these opportunities locally, right? God forbid, if something bad happens, and we live in a time when bad things are going to continue to happen, find ways to make those rallying cries, right? And I shared that example from the Pittsburgh Steelers earlier. I did a little bit of work in Pittsburgh back in 2020, and from talking to faith leaders up there in particular, it seemed clear to me that they did a lot. The community came together, like they did a lot of what we're describing in terms of trying to make it very clear that this kind of behavior was beyond the pale. We're running a little short on time, so I'm gonna get to my last bit of this presentation and then open it for discussion. In our previous session, we talked about American democracy. We talked about our strong minoritarian institutions and all the ways in which it's hard to make policy here, and that's undermining confidence in democracy and even leading to violence. So what do you do about that? You make the democracy better, right? My solution to a lot of the challenges of our democracy is more democracy. It is a better functioning democracy that better represents the views of the American people. So in these slides, you will find a list of orgs, and there are hyperlinks. You can just click on the links in the slides to just look at different orgs working on different relevant issues, right? So I would argue campaign finance reform and all the dark money in our politics that makes it hard to pass legislation that most people want is part of what is contributing to our national malaise, right? Other reforms, things like ranked choice voting, obviously ditching the electoral college. There are a lot of things here that are worth considering. And if this is your cup of tea, by all means, get on these organizations' websites, get on their mailing lists, maybe volunteer. These things will help address our polarization problem and our drift toward violence. We also have to talk about race, because this is America. Look, so that slide I showed at the beginning, showing that using congressional votes and the distance between the votes by ideology as a metric for declining polarization in the early 20th century, that's true. That's all true. This graph juxtaposes that same line from the House of Representatives with the percentage of the American population that's foreign born. Sure, you can all read graphs, right? And this data only goes to 99, but you get the idea. The trend line is pretty clear. There is a correlation. There's just a very obvious correlation between polarization and our racial and ethnic diversity. And you will recall last week when I listed structural factors driving polarization, the very first one I listed was demographic change, right? Where does that leave me as an American? Well, we've got some issues we got to work on, right? I think it's fair to say we have never sufficiently resolved the legacy of slavery. That's one way of putting it. So we got to work on that, right? All of these big, hard, thorny questions of the, fundamental structural racism, enormous, racial wealth gap in this country, all the ways in which opportunity is quite unequal, particularly for many Americans of color today. That's part of what's going on here. In the big picture, what we're trying to figure out as a country is how do we truly build a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy, right? So therefore, that leads me to some of these resources that I've got here on the slide, right? Worth noting, and you can, call your congressman and your congresspeople and your senators about this. There is a bill on the table to develop a federally backed commission to explore reparations. That's a big deal. And here I would just lift up the experience, but also the academic literature of transitions from armed conflict in other countries, right? There's a whole literature around how to build national truth and reconciliation processes, right? When countries come out of horrible civil wars, when you have a system like apartheid in South Africa, there are techniques wherein the government backs a process that allows everybody who's been victimized through this violence or this oppression to tell their stories, to have some mechanism of accountability for some of the perpetrators, some means of redress, right? I mean, there's, in the last few years, I think there's an overdue conversation in the United States about reparations. I think that's very important. That's part of this. But I actually prefer the term transitional justice. That's the academic term in literature, because it's not just about money. It is about a broader, ideally, national conversation about what happened. Why is it that, to this day, right, the wealth gap between the median African-American household and the median white household is like 17 times? Why is that? You got to talk about that. And I don't mean like us talking about it. I mean, it needs to be the headline story on the national news for 2 months every night, as, a series of panels and commissions around the country bring in the voices of Americans to talk about it. And then there's some, related process of material or financial compensation, right? But the point is, these are big, thorny questions, but they are not without solutions. So one thing you could do, and Senator Booker is one of the people supporting this legislation, give his office a call or call the people who aren't supporting it, right? That's one way to think about it is, what is the role of the federal government in this? Because in every other country since 1945 that's really addressed this kind of thing, there's always been a major role for the state, the national government. We should think about that. We can't do that right now, right? The Biden administration is not going to get that through Congress. So what can you do short of that? Well, there are other tools out there, right? The Kellogg Foundation, click on the link that is in this slide. They've got this toolkit that, in theory, anybody could use to run a kind of truth commission process in your community. That's not nothing. That's not nothing, right? It's not Desmond Tutu in South Africa, but it's not nothing, right? The Equal Justice Initiative, the guys who run the lynching memorial down in Alabama, also have resources. They have a whole process. Where I used to live in South Carolina, the community there was going through a process of excavating the history of a particular lynching and the story of a particular victim in the county where I used to live. I mean, hundreds of people, coming out on a weeknight to talk about what happened, explain who this poor person was, why he was murdered, right? There is value in that, even if it's not the same as, a grand national effort. So I think that's all worth looking at. Last thing I want to say, and then I will stop talking at you. And again, this slide could be the source of a 2-day training, but we don't have that kind of time. The point is, when you are in these difficult conversations, you're in the mix with your uncle, who you're always getting into it with, there are a number of tried and true dialogue and conflict resolution techniques that you might employ in your toolkit. Number one, pause and reflect. Be aware of how your body is responding in the moment physiologically. It's stressful to have these conversations. Your heart rate's going to be up. Your breathing accelerates. You're sweating. Be aware of that and just hit the pause button. And you may have to vocalize. You may have to say, just give me a minute. I want to consider what I say next. Or you don't have to say anything. You just take that deep breath, right? And then you pivot a little bit. You say, okay, so I think this is where we're at. This is where we're stuck. Or I hear you saying X. But be intentional. You got to go into these conversations preparing yourself psychologically for how hard it's going to be, and preparing yourself to take those pauses, not to get sucked into the cycle of quick emotional reactions, which generally aren't that productive. Relatedly, always helpful to return to the big picture. When you get stuck, or you start to get angry, or your uncle starts to get angry, back up. Hey, Uncle Bob, let's both remember why we're having this conversation. You have your views, I have mine, but we're trying to better understand each other. That kind of little verbal reframing can help you move on or reset the temperature a little bit. Classic move. Let's say you've had 4 sessions with Uncle Bob. You're making progress, right? Here's an exercise the two of you could do. You each try to write the other person's story. Literally write it down on a piece of paper, on a computer. Write in 3 paragraphs why your Uncle Bob believes what he believes and ask him to do the same for you. That's a very good exercise to help you test each other and understand how much do you really understand where they're coming from. Next, and I've quoted the classic conflict resolution text by Roger Fisher and Bill Urey, Getting to Yes. Separate the interests from the positions. This is, I mean, I use this constantly in my daily life, right? What people say is often not what they need. It's not because they're lying to you. It's because we get stuck in certain positions, and we ourselves, especially if we're in an argument, may lose track of what it is we need underneath all of that, right? The classic case of this, of course, was the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, the Camp David Accords from the late 70s. You know, Egypt kept saying, give us all our land back, get out of the Sinai Peninsula, or there's nothing to talk about here. Israel kept saying, we can't leave the Sinai Peninsula. We need it for security. Okay. The underlying interest of the Israeli side was security, and the interest of the Egyptian side was sovereignty. They needed to be able to show they could plant their flag on every square inch of Egyptian territory. And both sides got that, right? They came up with this mechanism to have these international monitors, this sort of tripwire in the Sinai, so that there's no way that Israel could be attacked by Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula. And Egypt got its land back, right? The things they said were separated from the things they really needed, and they got a deal. Okay, again, you're in this process with your Uncle Bob, and this one gets a little more complex. Maybe this is more appropriate for intergroup dynamics. But it's worth, if you are getting to a place where you may actually have agreement, where you've moved beyond, okay, I'm listening to your feelings and you're listening to mine, we're understanding each other. It's always worth thinking about a win scenario. Maybe that's a mutual scenario. Like maybe it's how you both together will say, oh, these are the things we agree on. Maybe it's, through this long process, how does the other side save face? Maybe your Uncle Bob has moved a little bit. Maybe his position on immigration is different. Okay, and you can feel good about that. You moved him a little. But as you get into that, you want to think about what can you give the other side that allows them to show that they did move a little. They made a concession. They compromised a little in a way that is face-saving, that helps them show, or even psychologically, even to address the cognitive dissonance, because none of us like to ever admit we were wrong, God forbid, to make them feel that way in which they've moved, the concession they've made is good for them, right? It's not just that you won them over or you strong-armed them. Think about that. Last but not least, I think this is the first thing I said last week, and I will close with this remark. Have grace. This is hard. It's hard for everybody. If you go into these processes, you start these conversations, as I'm suggesting, it's going to be hard for you. It's going to be hard for the other person. Don't beat yourself up. Set your expectations reasonably, and know that this can help. That's the last thing I want to say is, yes, there's a lot going wrong in our country. This is very challenging. It is potentially quite dangerous. But there is also, half a planet of experience demonstrating how deeply divided societies, multi-ethnic states, countries coming out of civil wars have addressed differences much more profound and in more challenging contexts than that which we now face. And these are just some of the techniques that I think we can use that will help. So let me stop there. I think we got 10 more minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Happy to talk about whatever.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Nathan. Let's start off. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions?
Jim.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. This is terrific. I am a Rotarian, and thanks for the shout out about Rotary. Now, there's also Lions and Kiwanis and a lot of other groups. My question, though, is going to be, what about church congregations. I think many of us belong to congregations that are bipolar, if you will, or multipolar, but it seems like we want to be so polite at church, you know. So do you have any wisdom about how to get these conversations going in a congregation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to approach this. If you're in a congregation that has some ideological diversity, maybe you set up a small group. You know, maybe it's if you have a Bible study hour or an activity hour after your worship service, put it on the program. You know, we're gonna have a set of dialogues about some of our country's political divides for those who want to sign up. And if you did want to go that route, there are a lot of resources out there. In fact, I can share a link to a website of the Carter Center network that I support in Georgia. They have a whole faith initiative that's got a list of dialogue guides, you know, conversation starters. I mean, you could basically take a kind of a template that you could follow if you got people to sign up and say, all right, we're going to go through this like workbook and we're going to try this. Like, so there are definitely resources there, and I'll share some of that with Anna after we're done here. The other thing I'd say about the faith space is, you know, in my experience, there are also a lot of congregations that are pretty politically homogeneous, whether either they all lean pretty left or they lean pretty right. If that's your experience, then maybe find another church, you know, find a faith house of worship that you know leans politically different, and reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to do like a series of, you know, structured engagements. I think there's a lot of value in that. I actually worry about the extent to which a lot of faith spaces have themselves sort of sorted. They're either, you know, pretty much all progressive or they're all conservative. I think I saw a question in the chat about the signaling. Books to study with your congregation. Sure. I mean, the book one of the books I footnoted here, Peter Coleman's book, it's called The Way Out. I think it's called Overcoming Toxic Polarization. Start with his book. It's very approachable. I mean, that you could do a book study on that book, right? Commit to reading a chapter a week and you know, have group discussion. That wouldn't be a bad start. The signaling technique, just that's a simple one. Just the idea that when you know you're going to get into a topic of conversation that's very emotional for you, warn the other person first. Just tell them, oh, you know, this is hard for me, or sometimes I get kind of upset talking about this. It helps them understand how you're going to react. Looking at the questions in the chat. Context theory slide, sort of structural elements, foster positive dialogue in diverse communities. So can you shift communities towards these norms, or does it mostly come from forming new groups? That's a really good question, Thomas. And it's tricky. Look, I think we have to keep in mind the importance of having a sense of community and belonging in all of these conversations, right? One obvious example is, you know, folks who've become, you know, quite fervent supporters of former President Trump. Clearly, they derive a sense of community from that engagement. They are part of something bigger than themselves. That engagement meets other needs that are very fundamental to the human experience, needs we all have, needs for belonging, right? Which is why, you know, sorting some of these issues out and finding common ground can be really hard. I think this is the answer to your question. I think it's going to be a combination of both. There are certainly examples in our recent history of people shifting their own norms or shifting into other groups, right? You've seen this from some of the sort of never Trump Republican set who've moved left on some of their views, and in turn, in some ways, maybe the left has moved toward them. And you've seen a little bit of a different community forming, at least in as much as this group, you know, agrees they have concerns with President Trump. But I think part of the story for us as a country to get out of this will have to be finding ways to change the norms of groups, you know, as a whole, and how we do that at scale is really hard. I think we talked about some techniques that are worth trying, but I want to acknowledge that it's hard to do. I don't know that book by Sharon Lisa Harper, but I've worked with her a little bit and she seems great, especially for engaging more conservative Christians. Other questions or comments?
I see Kathy, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I can almost imagine my first conversation with Uncle Joe, but I can't really imagine re-engaging the second time and on. I would love just sort of how that might sound.
Well, there's a couple ways you could do it. I mean, you have that first conversation, and my immediate suggestion would be, before you close that conversation, tell him, Uncle Joe, I really appreciate your willingness to talk to me about this. In America today, it's hard to have these kind of conversations. I want to acknowledge that. It's hard for both of us. I appreciate you stretching yourself in this way, and I'd like to follow up. I'd like to keep talking about this stuff because, we certainly didn't resolve every issue today. That's sort of the first thing I'd do. I would plant the seed right then and there, and you could do it in a way that expresses gratitude, right? And acknowledges that this is difficult. And then you get to the second conversation and I'd say it's a mix of, again, don't, even on the second conversation, like, don't dive into the hard stuff, like, work in that humanization element, pull up some pictures of your dog on your phone first, like ease into it, right? Because you're literally cueing the other person. You're activating, synapses to remind the other person that you're not a threat, right? You're not at least an immediate enemy. So again, even on the second or third conversation, start easy, start with humanizing, and then, hey, Uncle Joe, last time we talked, you said X and Y, I said, A and B. I'm just curious if you've had further thoughts. I've been reflecting on what you said. It's nice to show that you were thinking about it. I appreciate that you said X, Y, and Z. As I've thought about it more, blah, 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 blah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Anna, do we have time for maybe one more question?
One more question, and then we have just a follow-up for part 3. Anyone else? Okay, great. Oh, Peter coming in at the last minute. Go for it, Peter.
Kids had dinner. You got a little, hopefully, moment to yourself.
Yep. After this, gonna try to nudge them towards bed, see how that goes.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts on that tension of, so a lot of this premise, particularly as you're talking about cousins, assumes that it's really important to stay in relationship with folks. And there's also a lot of conversation, like there are times when maybe it's not healthy. For me in particular, as a white guy with privilege, and a lot of the conversations don't impact me as directly, but they do impact people I know and care about. But also because of people's history of trauma, or this in society, or even in like church context, like undocumented immigrants sitting next to ICE agents in church, where like it's not just a theoretical thing, they're actually harmed by the politics and practices.
Yeah.
That's a big setup of how do you approach this polarization conversation when there's actual harm?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, Peter, and I should have made a note about this at the outset. Not everyone has to do the things I just said. Not everyone has to do all these things. It is entirely appropriate for folks to look at their own situation. Maybe that's the affinity groups you're in, your identity, and evaluate for yourself what you're comfortable with, right? I'm a straight white dude, pretty privileged, right? Like I know I can get into spaces with lower risk to myself than for many other Americans who have identities that would make them more vulnerable, right? So nobody has to do this. it is entirely appropriate for there to be a division of labor. And if I may, you know, when I zoom out and think about our country and where we're at and how we all get out of this, you know, I'm in spaces with people who are much more conservative than me, people who are much more progressive than me, all the time. And I make this point a lot, like, not every group on the left has to do this, right? Like, if this isn't your jam, that's fine. Like, don't do this. But some of us should. Like, those of us who have the white privilege, this is a way to use it. You know, not to be too blunt, but like, some of us should. If you can enter these conversations at lower risk, then you really ought to think about it long and hard. If you can't, then that's also totally understandable.
I really appreciate that, Nathan. So we do want to be respectful of folks' time. It is 7:01, and so we're grateful for Nathan finishing off with part 2. I will be following up with a survey, an email, and the slides, and any other resources, Nathan, you want to send along tomorrow morning. But we do want to tee up Dan. So Dan, if you want to wave, Dan is going to be leading our part 3 next week. It's going to be, so we had it originally hybrid from 10 a.m. to noon on Thursday, but we've switched it because we wanted to make this as accessible as possible. So we'll be moving it from actually 6 to 8 p.m. next Thursday, and it'll be 100% virtual. So folks who can make that time, we wanted to make sure, especially working folks, they'd be able to make it. And so I'll send over that information tomorrow morning, but next week it'll be the same time, but it'll go 2 hours. And Dan will be leading us through how we can create community action plans. So what does it look like to do this as a community in light of the elections? And so we can actually leave with some tangible outcomes on that. But otherwise, thank you, Nathan, if we can show some gratitude in whatever way that looks like for you all. But we hope you all enjoy the rest of your night. But thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Have a great evening.